Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, after last episode's dive into the classics, we're here with a pretty standard lockdown episode of MFV here, in which we cover two Netflix movies. First up, we've got the Korean space fantasy movie Space Sweepers, and then we'll be looking at the English period archaeology drama The Dig. But before we switch on to Netflix, Alistair, what else have you been watching in the last 2 weeks? I mean, I guess it could also have been Netflix.
This is not actually a Netflix film that I've been watching.
Yeah.
Although, to tell the truth, I have been watching a lot of Netflix because there's very little else to do. One film that I watched recently that came out towards the end of last year that I can recommend to our listeners is Minari, which is a really interesting and sweet little film that's been getting quite a lot of buzz, possible Oscar nominations, although we'll have to wait and see. It's a sort of semi-autobiographical film about the childhood of the director and screenwriter Lee Isaac Chung, about a Korean family who moved to America to start a farm as a way to kind of pursue the American dream. Yeah, various troubles and problems that they come across whilst trying to kind of get this farm set up in rural Arizona. And it's a really sweet story of like family, coming together, facing adversity. I kind of like it. It never really tips too far one way or the other. It's sweet and nice, but it's never saccharine. There's lots of sort of hardship and tragedy, but it's not misery. It's not too optimistic. It's not too depressing. It kind of walks a fine line, I think, of being a realistic portrayal of how difficult life as an immigrant to America is, but still, I don't know, maintaining this sort of balance of never tipping too far one way or the other.
Yeah, I've heard some award chat about this. I think, didn't Stephen Ewan get nominated for his part in it?
I think, yeah, he might have had a Golden Globe nomination or something like that. He's very good as Jacob, the father of the family, and the one who's most committed to making this farm work.
Yeah, I mostly know him from his part as Glenn in The Walking Dead, in which he was pretty good, but also maybe a little bit wasted as one of the few vaguely nice, upbeat people in this group of sad apocalypse survivors.
Yeah, he really shows how well he can act in this. I think it's an excellent performance, very, very nuanced. You're clearly wrestling with a lot of things like he wants to provide for his family, he wants to make his farm a success, but is also struggling against how difficult it is. And obviously the strain that's putting on his relationship, specifically with his wife. So I thought he's absolutely excellent, deserves any nominations that he gets. I think there's been a little bit of confusion or, sort of bordering on scandal with this film in that it's not eligible, I think, for Best Foreign Language Film at the Oscars or along those lines, because although it's almost all of it's in Korean, it's an American movie made in America and set in America, but it is not in English. So which I think led people to sort of ask, like, how can we categorize this film? Because although it's his best foreign language film, the category seems to apply to films made outside America.
That is, if nothing else, a semantic problem. Yeah, whoever names the award has confused me.
Yeah, because it is an American film made by like an American film director set in America, and I think like funded and distributed by American companies. It's just unusual that someone would make an American film that almost none of it is in English. But because it's an authentic film about the Korean immigrant experience in the 1980s.
I guess that doesn't necessarily stop it winning Best Movie, as Parasite proved to us the previous year.
Yeah, and it's eligible for the big awards. Yeah, another Korean film following along from Parasite, or film, about Korean people in the Korean language. So I think some people are probably hoping it will repeat the success of Parasite last year, especially as Parasite possibly opened people's minds a bit more to that a subtitled film is not really hard work and can be as entertaining and thrilling as an English language film. And this one, although in many ways is very different to Parasite in that it's much more sunny and optimistic. It's literally set outside on a sunny farm. Yeah, they're both quite funny. And also they're both sort of something slightly different, which I think people are responding to.
Yeah, no, it sounds fun. I was mostly considering seeing it just because I liked the idea of seeing Stephen Ewan do something a bit more interesting than just either strained optimism or extreme terror.
Yeah, no, I'd recommend it. We'll see if it gets any Oscar nominations.
Is this part of your annual programme of trying to watch possible Oscar contenders?
Yeah, trying to get through them, to have an accurate summary of the Oscars. which we will probably come back to you on at some point. It's certainly got a lot of buzz. We'll see what happens. Obviously, in the past, we've been quite inaccurate at predicting the films that are going to get Oscar buzz.
Wildly wrong on occasion.
Yeah, well,
Some of our predictions didn't even get nominated.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also the cover film for the most recent issue of Little White Lies, so it's definitely a film that's generating discussion, so I'd highly recommend seeing it. And it is just a fun, really nice, it's quite sweet, but not saccharine movie, yeah. So that's what I've been up to recently. Nick, do you have anything to recommend to our listeners?
Yep, since the last episode, I have read a book. In fact, I've been reading books continuously, which is my target for the last year met. The one I've wanted to talk about, which I finished most recently, was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. This is the follow-up to her book Jonathan Strange and Mr. Novel, which was adapted into a BBC TV show. But for the record, read the book. Its BBC adaptation isn't bad. The book is just much better. I feel like a lot of the appeal of the book was the sort of way you could sort of dissolve into the world, and she gave a lot of detail to this sort of supporting text and background character detail and stuff, whereas the TV show, just by into what it is, had to be a little bit more superficial. But anyway, yeah, the main difference between Piranesi and Jonathan Strange and Mr. Novel is that Strange and Novel was like noticeably very long. If you've ever seen that book, you'll know it's a properly chunky book of a thing, helped by the massive footnotes with all her explanatory text. Whereas Piranesi is quite short, a very brisk sort of, I don't know if it technically counts as a novella, but it's certainly a quite short novel. I breezed through it in 2 or 3 days. For me, only reading for about half an hour a day is pretty quickly. So yeah, this is about a mysterious young man who finds himself living in a labyrinth, I guess, in a mysterious series of halls dominated only by statues and stone features. And there seems to be nothing else in the world other than this. He just sort of keeps walking and keeps exploring through this, and there's this mysterious man he occasionally meets up with who's his only company, and it just basically goes deeper into this mystery of who this guy is and what this world is and how he ended up there. It's, as I say, it's quite short, it's quite straightforward. A lot of what this book is kind of atmosphere and building up this sense and this vibe of this place. If you enjoy like loving descriptions of stone hallways and stone statues and the sort of stillness and atmosphere and both the scariness and slight reassurance you get from these big statues, then yeah, you'll love this book. There's a lot of that. And there's also, once you eventually get into a wider world and some description of what's going on, there's also some of, kind of like I said about Strange and Novel, Susanna Clarke's ability to deftly build these worlds by writing out these sort of background materials or notes or articles and stuff set around it. So yeah, it's good. I probably slightly prefer Strange and Novel still, but in fairness, that's one of my favourite books of the last decade or so, so that would have been a hard one to topple. But this is another lovely atmospheric book from the same author.
Yeah, sounds really good. I do like a good sort of fantasy mystery when the sort of plot of the book is peeling back the layers of a world and finding out more about, you know, the world to solve a mystery or a problem that's kind of at the core of it.
Yeah, it's nicely done, because I sort of went into it not knowing anything about it at all, because, I don't know, it's one of these books where I didn't buy it off the back of reviews or whatever. I bought it just because it was by Susanna Clarke, so I didn't bother finding out anything about what it was about. So maybe that affected the way I approached it, but I was mostly just, oh, this is a description of the world, and then you sort of slowly realise it's also this mystery about how this guy ended up there.
Yeah, so it sounds really good. So this is a worthy successor?
Yeah, it's definitely a worthy successor. I don't think it's going to overtake it in my heart. It did mostly make me come away thinking, wow, that was really good. And you know, I should reread Strange and Novel sometime. Maybe not quite yet, because that book is, as I say, quite long, and I just finished another quite long book, which I don't think I've mentioned on the podcast previously. I haven't, I don't think.
You have not?
Yeah, the other book I read, the other gigantic book, was House of Government by Yuri Sleskin. Apologies if I did that name wrong. Which was a massive narrative history book about the House of Government in Moscow in the post-Russian Revolution Soviet years. And mostly a sort of heavily researched, heavily sourced way, telling the story of lots of people who lived within it in this sort of saga novel-esque fashion, sort of weaving together their lives and how one lives under Lenin and then Stalin, and how they die, to be honest, at the end. You get to the purges, and it's not a great time for mid-level Soviet officials living in the House of Government. They don't have a lovely few years. So yeah, it's a bit bleak, but it is a lovely portrait. I bought it because it was in quite a lot of best non-fiction of the 2010s lists when I was looking for some more non-fiction books to read, as part of the long dormant, but still ongoing, Nick Reads non-fiction strand. There was a break for about most of 2020 because I stopped reading prose because I no longer commuted to work, and that was when I did most of it. But I'm getting back into it now. Perhaps stupidly, I started off by reading this gargantuan 1,000-page tiny font history book. Shorter books now, guys. Shorter books.
Sounds like Piranesi is quite a change of pace from that. I suppose after a sort of a long, quite grim history book, you probably would want something that's shorter and not as depressing.
Yeah, the character Piranesi is the name of the lead character, as well as the title. He's a very upbeat guy. He's very excited and earnest about all these statues and all the people who he thinks might have lived in the labyrinth at some point and all the clues he finds about them. So yeah, he's very upbeat and excited and interested, even on the few occasions things do get a bit bleak in the story. It's a nice change of pace. I then moved on to a sci-fi book by Becky Chambers, one of her Wayfarers series. So yeah, picking up the mood a little bit. I'll probably read another depressing non-fiction book after this.
Wayfarer books are very good. That's something I can also recommend to our listeners.
Yeah, I think I'm a few behind in the series. I think I'm reading the second one and the fourth one just came out. But yeah, I think we've talked about them before quite a while ago maybe. They're very fun books in a sort of upbeat, colourful, diverse, chatty, friendly, well-developed space exploration vibe. Kind of like Firefly, if Firefly was a lot more concerned with getting the world building and the portrayal of the alien cultures right. This sort of found family space travel vibe.
Yeah, it's very much got that. I think it's got a bit more fancy elements than Firefly in that it's got aliens and AIs and things like that, whereas at least as far as they got into the world of Firefly, there was only humans.
In that way, I suppose it's slightly more Star Trek-y and there's a lot more other cultures and other species. So yes, I'll be reading some prose again. It's been fun. I'm hoping, where are we, late February? I've managed to keep this New Year's resolution up through a sixth of the year, guys. We'll see if I can go the whole way and read, I don't know, at least one book a month or something like that for the remainder of the year.
That's a good start, I must say. Once you got into the habit, it's easier to keep these things up.
Yeah, I'm hoping that once I start reading shorter books, things will speed up a little. I've already read over half of this Becky Chambers book, so we'll see.
Next up this episode, we will be discussing Space Sweepers, a new Korean sci-fi film from Netflix. Set in the year 2092, where Earth has become uninhabitable and people make their living sweeping space debris from orbit around Earth. The crew of one space sweeping ship, the Victory, discover in the ruins of a satellite a mysterious child who might be an android who's been hunted because they may be a weapon. We saw this film recently, so Nick, what did you think of it?
Yeah, this was fun. This was fun. Possibly not big or clever, but pretty relentless fun with just enough emotion filled in to make you feel something when it gets to the end and the drama ramps up and you think maybe everyone or at least a few of the characters might die. It felt a bit like Guardians of the Galaxy, actually. Maybe with the sort of slightly wry, smug self-awareness of that film stripped down a bit in favour of a little more sincerity. But it's got that sort of rollicking adventure, that team of characters who are, they're easily distinguishable from each other. They've got their line in lovable bickering down, and they're not left as sort of straight-laced heroes in that they have, some dark pasts or character flaws, but also they're so lovably portrayed, or they're so clearly shown as having soft centres that it's not often, to be honest, in that much doubt that they'll do the right thing in the end. And yeah, it's fun, breezy action for all the family. It's weird, actually. In some ways, this would be a nice, fun film to watch with the whole family on Boxing Day. It's got, fart jokes, lovable bad boy characters who never do anything that bad, a cute child who needs protecting, and there's a big bad villain who has very few motivations beyond just being pure, scowly evil. Good old Richard Armitage there, enjoying himself. Apart from some weird, surprising explosions of swearing and surprisingly intense death and violence, which just pop out of nowhere and then disappear. Odd film sometimes. It's very fast, very zippy, very much scoots sometimes from one tone to another, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. I agree with you that it's a kind of a big, fun, fast-paced kind of space adventure film. Yeah, kind of when it's at its best is when the characters are kind of zooming around in space, being chased or chasing bits of debris, and it's really, really spectacular. We just got a new TV, and it's pretty big. Considering I've had the old TV actually for quite a while. Watching a TV that's like maybe 10 years old, and this looked phenomenal on a nice big 4K TV, and it does look brilliant. And it's just it's really great when they're shooting around in space. I got definitely those Guardians of the Galaxy vibes from it, with the humour and the colourfulness and the sort of fast paced. It was kind of maybe a bit Fifth Element at times. It felt as well, which is another kind of fast-paced, colourful sci-fi space adventure, and also like a bit of Firefly as well thrown in with the kind of found family group of, as you say, sort of lovable rogues, some of them with dark pasts but who are basically nice people and only do nice things. So yeah, I mean, the main thing to watch this is just for the fun space chasing bits. And yeah, actually I agree what you say, that it would be a good sort of slightly hungover Boxing Day film in that it's not particularly taxing, but it is a lot of fun.
Although, as I said, it does also feature some occasional bouts of extreme swearing or extreme violence, so maybe not for the young kids. Yeah, aside from that, it is just mostly just good fun. The space action has an enjoyable sort of fast, zappy energy. Like, it doesn't stay still for very long. It's honestly, when you first start watching it, it's actually quite hard to keep track of what is going on. There's the very first space sequence where a bunch of space sweepers are chasing some debris, and then our heroes turn up to take it from them. It's actually quite hard to fully follow sometimes until you get into the rhythm of it, because it does zip by the spaceships without pausing or stopping to lovingly pan over things or give you like slow motion moments to make sure you can clearly see what's happening, which, as I say, it takes a second to get used to, but it's good. I think it distinguishes it a little from the Star Treks of this world.
Yeah, it's very fast paced. Yeah, there's a lot of things like shaky handheld cameras in space and things like that to kind of give it the sense of speed and things, which does make it difficult to follow. But it also really gives you this, the sense of speed and also this sort of epicness of scale as they're kind of flying their small ships through these like enormous space structures that are orbiting the Earth. You do get a real sense of like scale and things, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I think the world building is pretty well done for the most part. I like the way it mostly sort of chucks us in and just expects us to catch up, which might, to be honest, partly be because I'm not sure how much the world building actually makes sense, but to be fair, it doesn't really need to.
Yeah, it's quite straightforward. The sort of wealthy people live in the floating habitats around Earth. The poor people are forced to live on Earth where the sort of biosphere is being devastated. The world building kind of plays more towards the sort of message of the film, which is, it's not a particularly sophisticated message, which is we need to look after the Earth and try to heal the natural ecosystem there rather than go to Mars, which is the villain. Yeah, Richard Armitage is this evil billionaire who owns a lot of space habitats around Earth.
So evil. So completely and utterly evil.
Yeah, he is very much a Saturday morning cartoon villain. But I did like the fact that he's basically the richest man in the world whose goal is to move humanity to Mars so that he can be the king of Mars, and he's evil. And I was a bit like, well, this is a very unsubtle portrayal of someone who's well known to everyone.
I know, and a lot of these films, when they have these characters who are meant to be like successful popular billionaires who turn out to be evil, there'll be quite a few scenes where they act charismatic and friendly, and then it's played as a sort of weird non-surprise when they turn out to be evil. But Richard Armitage doesn't waste any time with any of that. He's just really, really evil from more or less the first time he appears, and just goes continuously more evil until he reached a point where he's getting into his space exoskeleton and chasing our heroes. Yeah,
and he has this sort of weird thing when he kind of transforms into some sort of like beast type thing with his veins kind of pop and things like that. It is like I say, sort of Saturday morning cartoon villain territory. But I did like how it's just such an unsubtle portrayal of Elon Musk, basically. So.
Although that never really went to the fun places I was hoping to. The sort of vein-popping transformation. I kept waiting for him to turn into a monster, and he never did.
No, he did not.
His final battle thing, he was in a suit of armour, which was like, no, I wanted you to turn into, I don't know, fucking Space King Kong or something.
Yeah.
But alas, that never happened.
No, that did not happen.
Spoilers for things that don't happen.
I thought Richard Armitage was very good in that he sort of, again, does this kind of very big, camp, kind of grandiose performance. He's a big guy with like a deep, rich voice. You could believe him as a sort of somewhere between a sort of a billionaire CEO and kind of dictator of these kind of floating space settlements for the ultra wealthy. He's got presence, he's got grandiose stature, he can act well, and obviously is like doing the kind of camping it up as the big villain. So I think it's a great bit of acting and it's a great bit of casting.
Yeah, and it's another way in which, to be honest, it mostly just feels like a fun space adventure for the younger end of the family. Again, apart from the occasional weird 18-rated moments. It's got these villains and it's got this straightforward, lovable family feel. And the slapstick physical comedy is good. Sometimes the quips have that slightly lame sort of... I mean, that sounds like a joke, but it doesn't actually feature one. It's like, oh, that's just a thing where someone said something that sounds vaguely wry, but it's not actually funny. I see you're taking the child for a walk. Is that a joke? Is that just something you've said with the cadence of a joke?
I don't know, maybe it's one of those things that's lost in translation.
Yeah, probably.
Because the film it's mainly in Korean, but there's bits of other languages, like Richard Armitage speaks English, and they have a quite clever conceit, which is, it seems to be that everyone has a sort of universal translator built in. So everybody speaks their own language, and everyone can always understand them. So there's a few characters, Richard Armitage and a few others who speak English. There's one character who speaks French. There's one guy who speaks a sort of pidgin English, which is also given subtitles. Yeah, which I quite like. It shows that the space sweepers are drawn from all corners of the world, and in this sort of future where the biosphere has collapsed and people have migrated to space, national and cultural boundaries have sort of ceased to exist. The big division is between the rich who live in their nice space bubbles and the poor who have to scavenge the wreckage, because of the fact that language and culture aren't barriers anymore when everyone can understand each other. But it also means it's a quite nice tapestry of different people speaking different languages throughout the film.
Yeah, and I liked that aspect of the world, actually, this sort of weird multicultural thing where just because the film is Korean, it doesn't mean everyone in the world is Korean suddenly. It just means that our heroes are, and the other characters, they spoke a range of language. I've no idea what our actual future space dystopia will look like. This one seems more plausible than some.
And there is a great moment towards the end. I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler, but it is one of my favourite bits of the film, which is obviously when all of the space sweepers of all the different nationalities come together in the final fight against the billionaire evil guy and his plan to unleash mass destruction, again for seemingly no reason. But yeah, it is a nice moment when all the space sweepers of all their different languages and cultures come together. You know, it's a nice portrayal of the future, despite the fact that it's also a portrayal of the future where the Earth's ecosystem has been devastated.
Yeah, and I think, although I'm not sure this is a film which is breaking its back to send a message, I think there is a lot of, it does have some things to say about, you know, the unfairness of a class system and money and so on, and the way that a lot of these space sweepers are having to like desperately pursue huge amounts of money just to achieve very basic things.
You could almost describe it as a post-apocalyptic film in that it's pretty apocalyptic living on Earth, you know, or it's a sort of dystopian vision of the future where they're kind of, what they do is they take contemporary fears and anxieties and kind of magnify them. So this film is kind of exploring the inequality in the rich-poor gap, specifically rich people's ability to insulate themselves from the problems around them in that they live in their kind of space bubbles that aren't affected by the environmental collapse of Earth, which everyone else has to struggle through. And also, you know, it's amplifying fears about if we don't look after the world, we could end up in this horrible kind of dust ball dystopian future where, you know, food and things like that is really scarce. You know, and the message is not, you know, particularly subtle. It's we need to care for the world. The world is everyone's responsibility, rich and poor. We need to prioritise looking after it. It's not kind of breaking new grounds with originality, but it is got a kind of clear message or moral to the story.
Yeah, no, again, it's pretty straightforward, but it's easy to understand. It's focusing more on making it straightforward and relatable and understandable than it is on breaking its back to have it make sense. I mean, some of the plot resolution at the end is a bit hand-wavy, to be honest. There's use of nanobots as magic, more or less. But in the sort of science, fantasy, Doctor Who, Marvel tradition, I don't think anyone actually cares as long as the character emotions land.
Yeah, it is quite Doctor Who at time, but yeah, I think as you say, we've got to the point now where if you can pull off the characters, people aren't so hung up on the science, which, I mean, this is not a film that you come to for accurate portrayal of orbital mechanics or engineering or science. It's more about, you know, the characters or, you know, and the story that you're invested in. It's not trying to pass itself off as believable. It's trying to pass itself off as sort of engaging and spectacular and interesting. And, you know, really the core of that is this, like, the core cast of characters on the ship. They've got a core group. They've all got quite strong personalities. You get a sense of who they are really quickly and kind of the differences between them. They've each got like their sort of tragic backstory that's gone into a bit different points. I mean, one of the things I did say about this film is that there are a few bits of quite heavy exposition, which kind of slow the plot down. There's about 2 bits when they kind of stop and do a big kind of info dump about what's going on or characters' backgrounds, which I suppose they just want to, look, we need to get this information out of the way and get back to our cool space adventure. But yeah, there were some bits of like quite large exposition, but mainly to fill in like backstories of characters, which is sort of needed.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said earlier, the characters are all very, very distinct, very obviously separate from one another. They have their distinct silhouettes, their distinct styles, and therefore it makes it quite easy to see how they interact and how they work. I think the exposition is mostly pretty seamless. There's one bit where, as you say, it stops for about 10 minutes so that the robot can tell us the story of I guess he's the main character, the one who seems to get the most play, Tahoe.
Yeah, and he's got the most tragic backstory.
The most title of the film, and therefore the most tragic backstory, yeah.
Although, yeah, it was very, very moving that, this isn't a spoiler because it's revealed quite early on, that he's trying to save enough money to retrieve the body of his adopted daughter who was blown out into space in an explosion in in a sort of space sweeping explosion. And she wants to find her body before it drifts too far into deep space, which is really actually quite sad. And when you kind of get the flashback of their story, it is really quite moving. For a film that's mainly about fun, zippy space chasers, that bit is kind of like, oh, that pulls at the heartstrings.
Well, yeah, and it does a good job of grounding that character's otherwise slightly mercenary desire for cash as presented during the rest of the film, which otherwise could be used to make him seem greedy. It suddenly becomes a lot more understandable, which is, I guess, a way they're using their dystopian class system setting to make us feel bad for him.
Yeah, that was a good, strong motivation. He's got the strongest character journey in that he has to make the inevitable decision to pursue his the thing he wants to achieve, which is to find this dead body versus the thing he needs to do, which is to unite with his friends to save the child that's still alive. So yeah, he's got the strongest character arc. I also really liked the character of Captain Chang, played by Kim Tae-rae, who was, I thought, yeah, just great badass space sweeping captain, doesn't take any shit, is an excellent pilot. Yeah, I thought she was very good and a sort of standout character.
I thought she was one of these characters who seems like there's more going on below the surface, but we don't really get that much look at what it is. Like if they do a sequel to this, and I genuinely have no idea if that's on the cards, it's left possible at the end, but who knows? But yeah, they didn't get that far into it in this film. I thought, what's his name? Park had a good little arc within the story. Not as much as the main character, but still, he got some stuff.
Yeah, each character gets their arc, which works really well. There's also the robot as a kind of essential part of a sort of family space adventure. There's got to be one either non-human character, either alien or robot. The sort of slightly sassy robot, obviously, is a good part.
Yeah, I was hoping for more sass from the sassy robot. It was I don't know, the robot seemed to have a strange vibe in which it went from being slightly sassy to like aggressively homicidal, back to slightly sassy again. I kept struggling to fully get a handle on what kind of comedy robot this was meant to be, but at least some of the lines were funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a very straightforward, fun space film, but if that's what you're after, strong execution.
Yeah, and it's I'm hoping, again, like similar to what we were saying about Parasite before, I suppose another Korean film, I'm hoping that it's helping breaking down the barriers that people have about watching subtitled films, in that it's on Netflix, it's as accessible as any other film. It's like, now we're not buying our films from like HMV or Blockbuster. People aren't setting up these kind of artificial barriers, like let's put all the non-English films together in a section, and label them as films that are more difficult to watch, you probably want to avoid because they're not in English. Now that everything's just kind of presented equally in front of you on Netflix, and it advertises it to you with the same sort of vigor it advertises any other film it thinks you might like, and you can stick the film on and then just relax and enjoy it. So I'm hoping that Netflix is opening up barriers for people to be watching more non-English language sci-fi and films like this, because there's a lot of great stuff out there, this film included.
Yeah, I've certainly, as I've said before, watched more subtitled stuff in the last year or so than I have for a while. I assume that's because it's also part of some broader cultural trend. It might just be because you're nudging me towards it, but I think it's happening a bit more generally as well.
Yeah, I think, and like say Netflix.
Well, yeah, Netflix, Parasite, yeah.
Yeah, it's making foreign language films more accessible, which is and foreign language TV, which is a good thing, and this is part of that process. So don't let the fact that it's in the Korean language put you off. It's really, really fun.
Yeah, regardless of what language it's in, this is possibly one of the most mainstream blockbusters we've covered for a while. Enjoy.
Finally, this episode, we will be discussing The Dig, a new movie about the excavation of the Sutton Hoo burial ground on the eve of the Second World War. This film stars Kerry Mulligan as Edith Petty, the owner of the ground, and Ralph Fiennes as Basil Brown, an expert treasure hunter. We've seen this film. Nick, what did you think of it?
Lovely film, lovely film. I'm going to nitpick it a bit in a minute, but fundamentally very relaxing. It does a good job of relaying the history and the characters in a very sparse way. It's got a very sort of reserved British thing going on, in which, it's not in what the characters say, it's in how they stare thoughtfully into space after they've said it. Ralph Fiennes and Kerry Mulligan especially are particularly great at pulling this off, and when it works, there's a real swell of emotion in there, and a real sort of burst of sadness, or, sort of rooting for the characters to just get their feelings out, or resolve things, or achieve their goals as they stand there looking conflicted about it. And it keeps things high, it makes you care. It's a real sort of intensity in a lot of the bits with those two characters. There's also lots of long lovely shots of the countryside, or I think the whole film's got this sort of brown dirt sepia filter over it, which gives it a very memorable sort of deep earthy appearance. It's a very enjoyable film to watch. It's one of those storylines which sort of sneaks up on you with how much you've been lulled into caring about it. So a lot of this film, especially the first half of it, I'm broadly very positive about. I came away with very warm feelings about the characters. Unfortunately, it also has a slightly thin subplot in the second half about a junior archaeologist played by Lily James, who turns up and has very little storyline relating to the archaeology and lots of storyline related to her marital troubles, which isn't as good. It's not a terribly written storyline for what it is, and again, she and the actor playing her husband aren't terrible in it, but it's just a bit generic and doesn't feel as interesting or as well considered as the other stuff. Unfortunately, that to me drags the film a bit down from wow, that was great, to that was pretty good. But, it's still pretty good.
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, I think the core of the film is Kerry Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes and their relationship. The film really gets the class dynamic across very well, which obviously, in the late 1930s, the class dynamic was a big part of British society, and it's done in a sort of subtle little ways, in the fact that Basil Brown, the Ralph Fiennes character, he's not allowed to come to the front door of the house, that Edith lives in, and, he sort of must live in a sort of separate compartment or sort of separate bit of the house while he's staying with her on site. And there's very much a dynamic of class difference between them. And it's not like Edith Petty is a duchess or something like that. She's not, right at the top of aristocratic society, in England. She's just a wealthy landowner from the upper caste. Her dead husband was a colonel in the army. She's wealthy and she's got more class status, but there's this clear big divide between the serving class and the owning class, which the film kind of gets across, I thought, really well. And also the fact that Basil Brown, he's not trained as an archaeologist, but he is an expert in the soil of that region and in treasure hunting and digging. And later in the film, they introduce, respected, well-educated and much posher archaeologists coming from the British Museum, played by Ken Scott, who's great in everything, who also has this kind of class-based prejudice against Basil Brown. And it really gets across like how this sort of soft-spoken, mild-mannered English countryman really had to fight uphill against his sort of class prejudice in order to get his expertise recognised.
Yeah, that's the other classic British dilemma shown in this film, yes. There's the eternal battle between emotions and repression, and then there's also the people versus the poshos.
Yeah.
Which is also enjoyable. And as you say, the Ken Scott character who turns up and just is, I don't know, it's a bit of a love-to-hate character, really, or at least a love to slightly resent.
Yeah, and I do really like Ken Scott, and long-term listeners to the podcast will remember all the way back in the first ever recommendation we did, the first and second episodes, was Messiah starring Ken Scott, which is still one of my favourite TV shows. So yeah, it's good to see him out there getting work. And yeah, I thought he was good in this film, and his character's a bit of a journey in that at first he comes across as someone who's, an arrogant posho who isn't going to, respect the expert work that Basil Brown's put in, but over time learns that he's got valuable skills and learns to appreciate him and take his expertise on board. There's a growing there.
I don't know, a lot of the drama or stakes in this film seem to be kind of emotional. It's kind of like, oh my god, what's going to happen to the Kerry Mulligan character and her son and stuff. I don't know, I never feel like there's a huge risk of massive drama or a punch-up or a fight or a stabbing or anything.
Yeah, it's sort of the quiet, simmering class tensions are sort of the issues. I guess the most dramatic thing about the film is not so much them excavating these Saxon burial grounds. It's the kind of the looming presence of the Second World War, which is woven quite well into the background. There's various bits like they see planes flying overhead that are sort of drilling for the outbreak of war. They weave in at various different points. People listening to the radio and the speeches that led up to the outbreak of war, including the famous one that Neville Chamberlain gave when on this sort of declaration of war. They kind of weave it into the background, and there's a sense of rising tension throughout the film as the kind of inevitable conflict sort of looms over them.
Yeah, and as you say, it never becomes a crushingly depressing film about how they're all off to die. It's just sort of there. You could probably read into the fact that a lot of them might be about to die, but
And there's also, kind of, again, this film does not want for subplots, shall we say. I guess maybe they thought that the storyline of people digging the mound and find what they were looking for needed some embezzlement. And I guess it's sort of like every British thing must somehow relate to like the war or the Napoleonic Wars or like some great, like every British historical film must relate to some like great British military victory. But I mean, it is accurate that I guess they were excavating Sutton Hoo in 1939. I mean, it's not inaccurate to weave the war into this story. But yeah, the fact that this film does not want for subplots, there's Kerry Mulligan's brother, or was it cousin, turns up and he's enlisted in the RAF and is going to be a pilot. Yeah, and obviously that's that's very dangerous and he might die, and that's another subplot on top of all the other subplots.
Yeah, there are about a million things going on. And as I say, the only one that tips over into feeling like a bit much and annoying me a bit is the Lily James one, just because of the sheer amount of space it gets for what it is.
Yeah, it's probably the weakest part of the film, and it's just partly because its inclusion is so bizarre. It's almost like they felt like this film has got to have a love story in it. There's so many reasons why they can't have Basil Brown and Edith getting together, partly because, as we discussed, there's like a big class difference that would be insurmountable for them at the time, and also it's like flagrantly historically inaccurate because these are actual real people.
Although it was hinted at in one scene, in a weird way.
That they have a sort of deep unspoken connection that our British button-down sensibilities prevents people even acknowledging the existence of, but can be told through long lingering looks.
And there's one scene where they're meant to be having dinner and she gets herself ready in a nice dress and then his wife turns up and she looks a bit disappointed.
Yeah, and we're supposed to infer a lot from that. It's good old-fashioned British, long lingering looks. But this plot line involving Lily James is very much like there must be some kind of love story, so we shoehorn this in somehow. And it's bizarre because the Lily James is married to another archaeologist who's in the closet, and she sort of falls in love with Edith's brother, who she's barely met and spent about 3 seconds with apparently before they're sort of falling in love. This is the bit I think that is kind of really beggars belief, is that she leaves her husband for him, whereas like in 1939 it's a very different world to our world. The class system and these sort of Victorian values were still very much a part of society. A woman leaving her husband is like a huge risk to take. She's sacrificing all of her social status and standing within society. Obviously, it was incredibly sexist that women were treated in this way, but it seems like an unrealistic thing to do, and it doesn't really acknowledge the pressures that were on women at the time, that you couldn't just leave your husband. And also, homosexuality was illegal in 1930s, and that's never really gone into. It's just very much so like he's in the closet, he meets a man he can be happy with. She's a bit miserable. She meets a man that she can be happy with. Everyone's happy. And it is nice to have, I guess, like LGBTQ stories that have like happy endings, because there's so many with like sad endings. But at the same time, I think it almost glosses over how difficult things were for women and for LGBTQ people in the past. And by glossing over how difficult they were in the past, we're not really helping the present. And it's also weird because this film gets the class dynamics so right, but gets the sort of gender and sexuality dilemma so wrong.
And also it has, whereas everything else centres around this dig, that storyline just always feels like it's going on somewhere off to the side. It's a bit... That's not what I'm watching the film The Dig for, guys. Where's the dig?
Yeah, get back to the digging.
Yeah, exactly. Just scrape that dirt.
I'm more into the digging than the ploughing. Sorry.
Oh, God. Yeah,
Feel free to cut that.
I don't know, I'm leaving that in. That's local flavour. I listened to an episode of the Book to Screen Club podcast, which covered The Dig recently, and did an hour and 40 minutes on it, and just went into great detail on both the difference between the book and the film, and indeed the book and reality. You may be shocked to hear, but by the time we reach the film, which is, an adaptation of a fictionalisation, we have departed reality a smidge. As far as I can see, the Lily James character did actually exist, which is actually quite surprising, based on how weirdly nailed on her plot seems in the film. I have not read the book, obviously, or done any historical research beyond listening to this episode of the Book to Screen Club. But she did exist, and she was the aunt of the person who wrote the original book. But apparently they were not close, and her subplot is just as slightly weird feeling in the book.
Oh, right.
Apparently in reality she's an incredibly accomplished woman who's had a lot of achievements in her career as an archaeologist, and therefore it's, if anything, even more insulting that everything she does in this fictionalisation revolves entirely around who she's sleeping with.
Yeah, that is unfortunate. I mean, they do have some bits early on when, like, again, she's not taken seriously as an archaeologist because she's a woman, and she's been hired by Ken Scott, and she thinks for her expertise, but it's because she's the lightest archaeologist that he could find, because obviously they're walking on some very sensitive ground and want someone who doesn't weigh very much. Which is, again, at that point they're really nailing the kind of the social values of the period, and how women weren't taken seriously, people who weren't educated at Oxford or Cambridge weren't taken seriously and came from wealthy families. I quite like the ragtag group of people who society overlooks, kind of making this enormous discovery between Basil Brown's expert in soil and archaeology, the Lily James's characters. She's an expert, but she's not taken seriously. This kind of plucky British underdogs struggling against the system to achieve something great, and then it dissolves as subplots are heaped upon subplots.
I mean, to be fair, I didn't think it dissolves entirely in the second half of the movie. I just found that particular storyline with the Lily James character quite tiresome, and unfortunately it does take up a not insignificant percentage of the second half of the film, which is again why this film went at that point from being a 5-star film to a 4-star film to me.
Yeah, no, it's not a deal breaker. It's just sort of stands out, just like a bit incongruous. But yeah, it really gets into the significance of the dig and what they found, which I really liked. The British Museum is a really interesting place that I enjoy visiting, and it's quite sad I haven't been able to visit it for over a year now. And I have been there and seen the Sutton Hoo discoveries that are on display. And if you're ever in London, it's free. It's worth visiting. It is an interesting part of British history that you can explore. And it's kind of sad that when they first put in the British Museum, Basil Brown's name as their kind of discoverer wasn't on the exhibit, although I believe it's there now. So I really liked how they dig kind of into the history and the significance of it, and how it changes how they viewed sort of British history of the Saxon period and how the archaeology sheds light on what was going on. It also gets across how dangerous it was. There's a bit when Basil Brown gets sort of buried in a soil collapse, and it makes you think that, like, surely digging into the ground isn't that dangerous, and actually no, it can be very dangerous.
Yeah, I like that bit again, just for, as you say, a quick moment of the dark side of archaeology. I was actually quite surprised he survived that. But then I was also thinking, it's only about half an hour or so into the film. It would be a surprise if Ralph Fiennes died. Although, as the Books of Screen Club pointed out, was CPR actually in that common usage back then? They're not actually sure.
I don't know. That's a good question. It's one of those things you think's been around forever, but probably was invented specifically at some point. There's another sort of slightly interesting stylistic take in the film, which I see some people criticise, but I really liked, which is there's a lot of scenes of characters talking and then their kind of voice plays out over footage, other things happening, either people talking and then you see them digging, or sometimes it's just like weather or like shots of the sort of the Suffolk countryside. And it's done several times with increasing sort of obviousness. It kind of gives you this sense of time passing, and the sort of passage of time is an important like theme of the film. It's about things that have been buried for a long period of time, the sense of like almost like timelessness of these kind of buried artifacts that link us to the past. So it creates this interesting sense of kind of time passing in a sort of strange way, which I liked and was an interesting stylistic twist. But I've seen some reviews that said they found it confusing, and some people they thought it made the film seem longer, but I quite liked it.
I mean, the only way in which I would advocate shortening this film is by, surprisingly enough, substantially cutting down the Lily James subplot. Personally, I would quite happily have taken a shorter film with less of that. But no, I thought the narrated montage stuff was pretty good for the most part. I thought, as you say, it did. Because, as I say, I've slightly weighted down my opinions of the film by spending so long criticising that one subplot. But I did think that the rest of it, which is still, I think, the bulk of it, I did find very moving and evocative and quite enjoyable to just sort of sink into for a while and enjoy this sense of people talking about the past and how important it is and how things get buried beneath these sort of dirty filters they put on the screen. It's a very sort of enjoyable experience. So I'm fine with that stuff.
It's a very stylistic film. It's very beautiful. Yeah, as I was saying, that the core performance of Carey Mulligan and Ralph Fiennes are both excellent, and they're both obviously great English actors at the kind of top of their game, doing great performance here. So I can heartily recommend it.
Yep, same here. And again, if you want to find out more about the context and so on, I fully recommend that Book to Screen Club episode. But just in terms of viewing the film, good stuff. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. Thank you very much for listening. As ever, if you want to find more content from us, up to and including old deleted scenes, written articles by Alistair, and yet more besides, you can go to moderatefantasyviolence.com, and if you enjoy all of that, then why not leave us a nice review on iTunes or the other podcast application of your choice. Thank you.
You can also follow us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, and you can find us on Facebook by going to facebook.com/Moderate Fantasy Violence, or by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook. If you want more from me, then you can follow me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, or you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can also find more from me at nickbryan.com, or if you want something more minute to minute, you can also follow me at nickmb on Twitter. Right, okay, and next episode, we're going to be catching up with the rest of the internet and finally talking about WandaVision, the Marvel Studios TV show that's been taking the world by storm. As well as that, we'll also be covering Tribes of Europa, a new Netflix show about, I believe, a post-apocalyptic Europe. So, all of that next fortnight. Until then, bye-bye.
Bye.